So wait, put it on, put it there. You know, and I also think that like there's a difference. You and I both know this between making a inflammatory comment on Facebook and provoking someone in a way, rather than like having an informational session that's open and honest without I'm not sure the results are that different, but like I think the approach gives you some good karma. You know?
Anything.
That's on. That's on. Like the red light would be off, so you just slide it over. And you can put it anywhere, you can hold it. If it's too much and you would rather like stop in the middle and just say like, David, like this is too much, I don't want this, that's fine too, and I'll give you this one. Okay. And I forgot.
Because
Just double check. Talking to that real quick. If that's loud. No. Oh.
now?
A little bit.
Now? Can you hear me now?
No.
No.
A little bit higher. I can also raise the volume.
Now? Is this audible?
Wait, we're positive it's on. And that's number 4.
Are you? Yeah. It did? Okay. Now?
Okay.
All right.
All right. So, are you okay using this kind of mic if you had to?
I'm
Or
okay with
even though
that.
you
This
did
does
it?
not.
That's so weird that that didn't work.
I think it's easier than going like this.
Well, obviously,
Yeah,
but
no.
it also did work just a second ago, so that's weird. But I might need to push it up. Just use this. I know that this makes.
Yeah.
Hold on, just one. Actually, here.
So I'm going to introduce you.
Check.
Okay. Now it's audible?
Yeah. Also, nobody's gonna be shouting over.
If not, I'll take that one.
Just don't outright.
Yeah, no.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Good evening. I'm so pleased that you were able to join us, and I just want to say that this is one of the largest non-High Holy Day crowds we've ever had. So, and that is probably the last moment of levity we'll have, because we are gathered here because our hearts are broken. We are not broken in spirit, but our hearts are broken, and they grieve for the hostages. We grieve for the lives that have been lost, and we hope that an evening like this with Dr. Heidi Lane will offer us a vision for going forward. And we may not find answers, but we will have a baseline of knowledge that we can work with, and that's a very helpful thing. Very often people will just find themselves in historical vacuum, and we can't be there. We need to be in the face of some very difficult circumstances. We need to be well informed, and an evening like tonight will do that. So, yeah. Okay.
Hi, everybody. So just 3 operational things. If you get too cold or too hot, know that our system runs on a one. You kind of have to let it go. It's 15 minutes. So if you see somebody move and touch the thermostat, it will change, but it will be 15 minutes from when you are feeling it. So just know that. Also, bathrooms are through the exit sign over there. Also, I'm going to be trying to check out about sound. If you think that Heidi is too soft or too loud, it needs to be louder. Whoa, it's way too loud. That's your hand motion. And lastly,
Okay. Very good. All right. Thanks so much, David. So let me just introduce Heidi. And at the end of the program, if you notice on your name tag, there's a number. It's like going to a convention. It's like you get the salmon. Oh, no. So when you have, at the end of the program, at the end of Heidi's talk, I will tell you where you're going, and with your number, you'll check out your name tag, and we'll get you into groups so we can have a discussion. about what we've learned about and share our feelings. Okay, so with that said, Dr. Heidi E. Lane, who is a member of our synagogue and very active and wonderful member of our synagogue, along with her husband, Christopher. Christopher, where are you? Right there, he's in the back. And their sons, Gabriel and Gideon. So Heidi is a professor of strategy and policy and director of the Greater Middle East Research Study Group at the U.S. Naval War College. She specializes in comparative politics and international relations of the Middle East with a focus on security sector development, ethnic and religious nationalism, counterterrorism, and the rule of law in transitioning societies. Heidi has her MA and PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of California in Los Angeles and a BA in Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. It is my pleasure to welcome, with the microphone, our own resident Middle Eastern expert, Heidi Lane. So Heidi's going to work with the lapel microphone and see if that works. If you should have trouble hearing her, we might make a move to this handheld mic. No one ever says to me, "Oh, Rabbi, you're too soft." That never happens. But other people may have those issues. So, Heidi, thank you so much, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Let me know if I'm audible. Yes? No. Okay.
Okay. So, so you know what? Let's turn. Are you comfortable holding the mic? Okay. So let's turn this one off. Yep. Yeah, she's gonna use the handle. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Very good. So you can take that off. Give that to me. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Here's the handheld. It's all good. And you've got your remote control.
Oh, yeah. Control. Okay. First of all, good evening, and thank you very much for coming tonight. This is, and thank you to the temple. Thank you to Rabbi Howard and Adina and David and anybody else who wound up having to work on this, because it's a lot to put together, and it's also very, very brave at this time. So, as you all know and probably have seen in the news, there are lots of places that are either not wanting to engage in this kind of conversation, or there are places that are overwhelmed by engaging in this conversation, and so it's kind of a special opportunity to talk. I do want to say that I've had lots of years on this larger topic of Palestinian-Israeli stuff. I haven't taught a course on it for many years, and I'm not a historian, so sometimes I have to refresh my memory on certain details, but mainly the presentation I have tonight is really not about the history of the conflict, and it's really more about what I think are some key things that are relevant for understanding what's happening right now, and that maybe will set us up for some discussion. And some of them you may know, some of them you may have other ideas about, and some of them, you may disagree with. But I hope I can give a sort of a brief overview. I hope it'll be about 30 minutes, and then we can, do some questions and conversation, and then move to the discussion part. The other point I was going to make is that I in no way want to project any kind of one moral stance. I don't want to have myself, I'm not making any moral judgments here. So if I sound like I am, bring it up in the question and answer, and maybe we can discuss it. See if I can do this. I did this morning and messed it up at work, so let's try this. Oh, and one more thing, and this may be the point of levity that the rabbi said we wouldn't have, which is that I have to use my disclaimer, which is that nothing I say represents the U.S. Navy or the Department of the Defense or the Naval War College. So it's all my own thoughts. So I'm going to talk about some key background issues here, a little bit about the early decisions and the birth of Israel, mainly to just put in context the partition in particular and the establishment of Israel. And then I'm going to go straight to basic demographics on both the Palestinian and Israeli side, contemporary demographics. and then an overview of Palestinian resistance movements, past and present, and maybe I can fill in a few details here and there. A little bit about the origins of Israeli settlements. Many of you here will already have knowledge about a lot of these things, but I find that this is the kind of topic that no matter how much you study it, there's never too much information to have, and never too many times to go back and think about the various details. And then I'm going to try to revisit a little bit about the Oslo Accords and Camp David too, because this is really the basis on which a lot of Palestinian and Israeli, at least peace conversations have been built. And many of us forget about what exactly happened in those years. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, that is the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and some of its consequences, and then I'll kind of sum up with some possible short and long-term consequences, and then I think we will open it up for discussion. I don't want to stand. Can you see over here with me standing here? Okay. Before the State of Israel was, as we know it, before the actual establishment, many of you know that there was a very long period of competition and contest between various players, certainly one of them being the British and the Mandate Powers. This is really the history that probably most people get when they read a book about it. And it really is, it's very contested history because of the different counts of who was where, how many Jewish immigrants or Jewish settlers from the Yishuv were in Israel or in the area that became Israel, how many Arabs there were, what they were called, when they were displaced and what happened. But the basic parameters to remind everyone of is that it was under UN auspices that the partition was made. And there were 11 countries roughly that were part of the UN Commission on Palestine. And I can't remember all 11, but one was Sweden, one was Yugoslavia, one was Guatemala, one was Mexico, one was Iran, which I think might surprise some people. And really the list is comprised of a lot of states in 1947 that actually really weren't very much associated with anything that had happened in Europe, or at least not directly. So, that's why you get Iran. It's also because at that time the United States was very good friends with Iran, and so that assisted it. And this is the genesis of what became the beginning of the State of Israel, the UN vote that was in favor of this establishment of partition between the Jewish communities that already had gotten there and then the existing, what we now consider Palestinian communities that were still in the state. And what happened after that, many of you know, those communities were not entirely in agreement with how things would work out after the British exited the area, but the basic bottom line is that most people would argue that the Palestinian leadership failed to take the opportunity to accept the partition as it was and get a foothold in Palestine, that they rejected it mostly out of hand, and they walked away from an opportunity to have a stake in this new state. And much of the rest, there's much blame on the Palestinian leadership at that time. Now, there are lots of views on this, and many of them I think would, and this is really, there's a ton of Israeli scholarship on this in what's called the New Historians movement, where they look at revision, they are considered revisionist historians in the sense that they look at declassified and old documents looking at this period, and their conclusion is that the Palestinian leadership at this time was simply not politically as adept as the Zionist leadership. And this makes sense to us today because you really have to have an idea about the international system, you have to understand how states work, and you have to have a language with which to communicate with the stakeholders, which were at this time certainly the British and the Americans and other European nations who were in the UN that had voting power. So this is the basis. And now I'm going to skip way ahead and talk about demographics in Israel today. A lot of you are going to be familiar with some of the demographics. I have to come over here and look at it. And this is from the Israeli Bureau of Statistics, the Central Bureau of Statistics, and so I feel that this is the way they break down the numbers. They count about 40% of the state are secular Jews, are Chiloni. 23 are traditional, are Masorti, a name I didn't actually identify as being in the census until I saw it. About 8% ultra-Orthodox, and you can see the rest. There are 2% of the state citizenry are Druze, and about 2% Christian, and then 14% Muslim. And I'm not sure what no religion is, but that's in the census data, so I put it on the slide. Total population is just under 10 million at this time in the last census. And you can see that over here on the other side, Arabs make up about 21.1%. Now, the nomenclature in the census itself says Arabs. I think that those Arabs would call themselves Palestinians, so what we're talking about here is the Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, those who live in the communities that you probably have been reading about, who are at this time sort of in a tough spot, many of them because they are Israeli citizens. They do not serve in the army, but they nonetheless take part in all other aspects of Israeli life and benefit as citizens. The Palestinian demographics, which I took from the Palestinian Census Bureau, which also, and also another organization called the Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs, which is a very reputable information, is that in Palestine, or what they would consider Palestine, I realize this is sometimes contentious, but they have 14.5 million Palestinians that they count in historic Palestine and the diaspora. And this is something that's only come about, I would say the counts have only come about maybe in the last 30 or so years, when Palestinian institutions like the Census Bureau began to build an idea of where Palestinians were, and some of it is a result of the Oslo Accords, because during the Oslo Accords, when you're negotiating who's going to be where, you have to have a count. And so they've gotten very good at counting. 3.25 million live in the West Bank, and 2.23 million by their count live in Gaza. And they also count numbers from the 1948 territory and then those outside of historic Palestine. So that would be Lebanon, that would be Syria, that would be Jordan, many in Jordan, and anywhere else in the world you can think of, the United States or elsewhere. The point that I want to make on this slide also is that the significance of what's called the Nakba in 1948, and that's in Arabic, this is the term that's used, and then a Naksa in 1967, these are the terms that are used to refer to refugees that come either from 1948 or 1967. So they're actually, the nomenclature is attached to the years when they were displaced from what is now Israel proper. And so that is also counted. And this is a very interesting thing because it's been come up a lot in the last couple of weeks because when, at least in some of the Arabic media, but also in general media, they're discussing refugees that have been there since 1948 or from 1967. So it's a very formal count. Now I want to just discuss a little bit about official politics in Israel, and many of you know a great deal about this, but I want to make a few points. One is that the emergency war cabinet that's in place now is really, it's been formed on the basis of this current war in Gaza. It's an emergency cabinet, so it is not in any way truly representative of what the population of voting Israelis necessarily would put into place, and it has therefore, I would say, a temporary legitimacy in that sense, depending on what happens. The 37th elected Israeli government, which was or will be again a 7-party coalition, is made up of the following parties. And some of them you will recognize. Likud, of course, is Benjamin Netanyahu's party. Then they have a smaller party, United Torah Judaism. Shas being the traditional party that is related to mainly Jews who came from Middle Eastern descent, or Sfaradim. This is a religious party that represents mainly that sector. And Otzma Yehudit is actually Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, who you may have read about, who is now the Knesset member who's quite far on the right wing and has been very vocal in his determination that the Palestinians that are in Gaza should be maybe relocated. So he's part of the far right spectrum. One other thing I want to mention is on the left, your left, your left, on the left side of the screen, are two graphics that come from the Israeli Democracy Institute, and they show you roughly how the composition of Knesset members have changed over time. And I want to underscore this point because if you look at their information, what you see is that over time, you have quite a few more groups in society. It's much more pluralistic in many ways, but you also have a kind of convergence in the sense that there are many more members of Knesset that actually come from the settlements. And I think this is important because it underscores how you get to quite a conservative cabinet, such as the 37th Knesset, but it also gives you a sense of the direction that official politics has been moving in Israel for quite some time. On the Palestinian side, in the Palestinian resistant movements writ large, there's a combination. There are many of them that were originally very sort of secular nationalist or Arab nationalist based. And then there are some that are more on the Islamist spectrum. And this kind of represents the two spheres. There's really not much in between. There are the former Arab nationalists or Arab nationalists. They are, if you remember the PLO, certainly Yasser Arafat was an avowed Arab nationalist, meaning that he didn't care about whether you were Muslim or Christian or what, as long as you were supportive of the Arab nation writ large and of Palestine, then that was the platform. Of those groups, Fatah is the largest. That is formerly the PLO under Yasser Arafat. And then there were two smaller groups which you don't really hear about much anymore, which actually used to be on the Department of State list of designated terrorist organizations. And after 9/11, they sort of fell off the list because they were sort of socialist Marxist groups, and nobody cared about those after the Cold War ended. They were run respectively by George Habash and a guy named Naif Hawatmeh. And these two, both of those individuals have passed away subsequently. And the groups are kind of they really don't exist to any great degree, except maybe in, I think there is a little bit of a faction still somewhere in Syria in the refugee camps, and maybe in Lebanon, but they're really not very effective. And they don't represent most Palestinians. They don't show up in elections anymore much. The Islamist movements, by contrast, grew out of the 1980s. They were part of a larger trend in the Arab world that was that used political Islam as a platform for politics. The Muslim Brotherhood is certainly one of them, much wider in the rest of the Arab world. And then Hamas is a subset of the Muslim Brotherhood. They actually broke off of the formal Muslim Brotherhood in 1988. And this is specifically in Palestinian areas. Their origin, or the reason for the break-off, was a dispute between Muslim brothers about whether or not it was time to use violence. And so if you remember anything about 1988 or around that period, that was coincided with the first Intifada in Israel. And so they were reacting to the first Intifada, and it set in motion this break-off. And for a long time, they were quite successful in doing more than just what they have been known for, which is very violent resistance, but also in building social organizations, feeding people. They built orphanages. They had a whole range of social they had a whole social system, which was very popular with Palestinians. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which you may have heard the name of quite recently, is a much smaller group, but also quite militant, and they were founded right after the Iranian Revolution. And the Iranian Revolution is kind of what inspired them, although they are not Shia Muslims, they are Sunni Palestinians. And they were led by a man named Fatih Shkaki, who is long since dead. But they still have some following, and they still have some presence in Gaza. And the rocket that was allegedly sent, the rocket that hit the hospital last week in Gaza that made, world news for days, was purportedly shot by this group, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I can imagine that this is probably accurate because they are, they're not very sophisticated, and I can imagine that they would want to do something in this period during this fight. And then also in the last 12 or 13 years, there has been ISIS and Al-Qaeda type groups that have entered into Gaza in particular. Maybe a little bit in the West Bank, but the main place where they've had access is in Gaza. And Hamas, surprisingly, had a lot of trouble trying to rein them in because Hamas did not want any other groups to be contesting their popularity and or control of that area. It remains to be seen whether we find out that maybe there are some types of those groups still there. I have some guesses, but I have no confirmation. I think I've said a little bit more about this, but there are a couple more points on this slide, and that is the Al-Qassam Brigades is the military wing of Hamas, and you probably are all familiar with that by now. But they also have a very adept political wing. Some of the members are in Qatar. Ismail Haniyeh is there. And there are lots of other members, and if you would meet them on the street, and if you have seen them on TV, if you've seen them on any of the news shows, they are very savvy, really look like any other political leader in the region. They're very good at what they do. And it is possible that at least this is possible, and again, this is my opinion, it is possible that the political wing and the armed wing were not in complete agreement about the attack in Gaza. I think that it's possible there was a split. They also are very good at winning elections, and in 2006 they won the legislative elections against Fatah, which is the main Palestinian Authority party. And the Palestinian Authority really has only been around since the early 90s. And they have never really run elections very well. So they're known to Palestinians as being politically corrupt and ineffective in terms of allowing any kind of public discourse through the electoral process. And Hamas, by contrast, became very popular and won an overwhelming victory in the legislative elections in 2006. The problem that Hamas faced at that time in making that legitimate outside of the areas where they have support was really mainly related to the fact that we in the world, and particularly the United States, we're right smack in the middle of the war on terror at maybe its highest point, when violence in Iraq and the insurgency in Iraq was very bad. And so there was really no political leverage to be had there to make an argument that an Islamist group that had been armed could have won elections legitimately and maybe been moving in a legitimate direction. And that clearly has long since passed, and I'll try to explain why. Just a little bit of a review about the Oslo Accords, and I certainly remember much of this because it was just fascinating at the time it was happening. But Oslo I, as you'll recall, was really not as much about what would happen as it was about mutual recognition. And it took so long for that to happen in and of itself, for Israelis to meet with Palestinians, for the verbiage to be Palestinian-Israeli meetings. And it also was, for a time, it was illegal for Israelis to meet Palestinians. I think until maybe even 1991, so that they would often meet outside if they were inclined towards peace negotiations. They would meet outside of Israel so as not to violate the law. And so the first step in the Oslo I was signed in 1993, and it set the framework for subsequent negotiations. Oslo II was signed in September 1995 in Egypt, and this is where you get the establishment of areas A, B, and C in the West Bank, which I'll show you in a second. But it also was so contentious in so many places, particularly within the settler movement, and I'll talk about that in a minute because I don't want to speak about it as a monolith. It most certainly is not. This was so contentious that it resulted in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who was then Prime Minister of Israel. And many of you remember this, I'm sure. But if you don't, this was perhaps the biggest cataclysm for Israel up until now. I would say it was the most politically difficult time, even maybe more so than the wars that they fought against other countries, because it was from the inside, and no one understood at that time how it could be that an Israeli had killed a sitting prime minister. Camp David, too, was equally contentious, and it wound up failing in the last stages. This was under President Clinton, and you see the picture there. These are the parties to the main parties to the negotiations. And this is Ehud Barak, former Israeli prime minister, on the left, and then, of course, Yasser Arafat, who did not live too much longer after this time. This phase was intended to resolve final status issues, and these remain unresolved today to, almost at every level. This was about the status of Jerusalem, who and what and where would be politically and religiously allowed to govern Jerusalem, and then about the right of return for dispossessed Palestinians. And this was not only rejected on the Israeli side in some circles, this was rejected by many Palestinians because, when you get down to the formulations of peace negotiations, you're dealing with, very, like legal issues, which get down into the weeds. And so these two things were proved too difficult to negotiate, and those negotiations basically failed. Right after this failed was the beginning of the Second Intifada, which lasted approximately from 2000 to 2005. And this was a period that you may or may not remember was really the peak of when Hamas got very good at suicide bombings, where they would send people in and blow up Israeli cafes and blow up restaurants and blow up any installation they could, and ultimately resulted in the wall that was built in Israel, which mainly solved the problem. And I'll come back to that. Before we move on, I want to just mention these are the areas A, B, and C on a map. This is an Al Jazeera map, but it's an accurate map. It's just that not all of them you can steal off the internet, and I'm very adept at stealing maps off the internet, but this one looked pretty good. So this is, it should give you a sense of how it worked or was going to work. Some of it was, it was implemented mainly, but the main thing that you want to recognize is that although areas A and B, one is strictly under Palestinian control and area B is Israeli-Palestinian control joint, the third one really kind of circles all of that because it's about security. It is, at the end of the day, the Israeli bottom line in all cases, in all negotiations, was that security is the most important thing for Israel, and this is the thing that we have to maintain. We can't compromise. And so a lot of that Area C was meant to assure that if the Palestinian Authority was not able to govern, which in many cases they weren't, or when there were periods of violence, that the Israelis would be able to secure that area and protect other parts of Israel and settlement communities. Just a few things about the Israeli settlement movement itself. This is a huge topic, and there have been some really great books on this, but it remains still a very sensitive topic for many people, not so much inside Israel, but outside of Israel, and I think is probably a touch point where a lot of political division lies about the degree to which this is the center of the problem. I tend to think that there's some argument there and that this is a real problem for Israel long term, but there are lots of ideas about this. Mainly the settlements began roughly in the aftermath of the 1967 war when Israel was, took over this territory, and they were originally known as the Gush Emunim. This is not really terminology that you hear too much anymore, but they at one point had an organization called Yesha, which is an acronym, which is Yehuda Shomron Aza, and meaning parts of historic Israel or biblical Israel that they believed was the real Israel and the greater Israel. So rather than accept the boundaries of the state of Israel as such, they argue, at least in the most ideological part of them, that you should be able to settle anywhere where Jews were in the land in the biblical period. And so they kind of run the gamut from right to far right on the political spectrum. And when I say far right, I mean they even include people who really have no issue with fomenting violence and who harass Palestinian communities on a regular basis. And they have some pretty strong objectives, and one of them is they do subscribe very often to the idea of transfer. So if you hear now in the news Palestinians or anybody saying that there is a plan to transfer Arabs or transfer Palestinians out of Gaza or out of Palestine to somewhere else, they're probably referring to their fears that relate to this population and this concept. This is not something that, you know, certainly Israel, the state of Israel embraces, but there are elements in some of the parties that now are in the Knesset that voice these kinds of beliefs. I already mentioned the current Knesset member Itamar Ben-Gvir represents some of this group, not all of it. You know, it's a quite diverse group, and there are approximately 400,000 Israelis who now live in settlements. This is, if you, in the early 1990s or mid-1990s, it was roughly 180 to 200,000, about, you know, whatever that is, almost 30 years ago. And it has grown quite substantially, and you'll see figures that are put out by organizations that show how many housing permits have been allowed for Palestinians versus Israelis, and there is a quite substantial difference. They're making inroads. Again, not all of them are extreme right. Many people are actually even secular. Maybe they moved out there because it was less expensive or because they could, you know, have a bigger house, but there's a pretty hard core in the middle of that. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the Gaza disengagement plan in 2005. I mentioned the suicide bombings in the early 2000s when they really hit a peak. They started in the 90s and then they really went way up, and they resulted in the building of the wall. Well, at the same time, Ariel Sharon was the prime minister, and he came up with the idea based on, you know, also his political bloc and his political perspective and that of those who supported him, that there was not going to be any period where you could have peace anymore or negotiation, and that you should really move to full disengagement. So the idea of unilateral disengagement was implemented in Gaza. And that would be that the IDF would exit Gaza, and Israeli settlements in Gaza, as you know, then were dismantled. They are mainly the blue area on that map. They were dismantled, and those individuals who lived there had to be relocated into Israel. Some of them by force, and some of them not. It was probably less dramatic than Israel prepared for, but it was very politically meaningful to the movement. However, even after that happened and Gaza was essentially put under control of the Palestinian Authority, Israel still insisted, based on this security paradigm, that they would control the air and land and sea, all security access. And this worked more or less for a long time. They were pretty successful until recently. And this was, again, the outcome of the Second Intifada. The unfortunate thing about this is that it also then isolated Hamas and at some point the Palestinian Authority inside Gaza, where they were unable to govern in ways that they had been before, and really conditions in Gaza have more or less deteriorated since that time, despite a lot of aid from outside, despite some periods of growth. It has been pretty much a failure for Gaza or for Palestinians completely. And it has resulted in the radicalization of the movement to some extent, but it has also completely sidelined the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be the governing body for Palestinians. And I probably am forgetting one or two things here, but on this basis, from this point, and then, as you know, from about 2007, there has been this blockade and this sort of up and down periods of violence from Gaza. I've only been there once, and it was in the year 2000. And to just give you a sense of how it is, it really was the worst place I have ever been. And I mean, impoverished to a degree that it's hard to imagine unless you've been in parts of Africa. And politically just, people were afraid. Just as an anecdote, I went into Gaza with one of Arafat's bodyguards because I was doing dissertation work, and someone told me there's a guy who knows a guy who's Arafat's bodyguard, and he will take you in so that you can interview one of the Hamas leaders. And I called up the Hamas office and made an appointment with their public affairs office, and I was set to interview a guy named Rantizi. And it seemed a little weird. They answered the phone and they gave me an appointment. But once I got into Gaza, and mind you, this is when the Palestinian Authority first was set up, they had uniforms, they were monitoring the roads, they were having traffic flow. It was quite remarkable to see Palestinians in uniform behaving as though they were running the state. And once we got into Gaza over the line, the gentleman I was with asked if we could stop by a home, and he removed his uniform and disarmed and put away anything that would have identified him with the Palestinian Authority. And I asked him, what are you doing? And he said, well, you might not know this, but if I wear my uniform here, Hamas will kill me. So it became pretty clear to me in that short moment that it was not the Palestinian Authority that had any control even at that time, and that Hamas literally had a fair amount of control over the whole area, whether people liked it or not. And that does not mean support wholesale. It means that simply no other options, particularly in recent years. So I will end there and just make a couple of last comments. I think that there are some possible short-term and long-term outcomes that we might expect. I'm sure many of them will be completely wrong, but I think it's pretty likely that we're going to see increases in intrasectarian divides between Israelis and Palestinians, because many of the things that divide Israelis now are at a fever pitch, meaning whether or not it's possible to be in a settlement and have state resources going to you to protect you, whether or not you have to serve in the army or whether you don't. And the population is very diverse, and it has also it has absorbed many, many people over the years that are not even they're not Palestinian, they're from other countries, such as the huge wave of Soviet emigres. And so it is really my sense that Israelis are as much divided with each other sometimes as not. And certainly that's true of Palestinians, certainly now. I think that it will be likely that at some point along the line, we're going to see a very big restructuring of the IDF and the intelligence services in Israel, because politically there's no way to walk out of this last catastrophe. The institutions that are there for the security of Israel have all failed, at least in the short term. And this is going to create a very big groundswell, I suspect, for changing the system. There is also, I think, and it's not, this is maybe an obvious point, I think Lebanon is likely to be much more destabilized in the coming months because Hezbollah in Lebanon is an irritant, and Lebanon is essentially a failed state. I mean, people that are very well off and very educated and have always lived at the top of Lebanese society now can't get money out of their banks and are essentially going to the Gulf states or wherever they can. There's huge brain drain, and everybody else who can't leave is declining in every way. There is also likely to be a very weakened security relationship between Israel and Egypt, and probably also Jordan, although we haven't seen direct evidence of it yet. But the security relationship with Egypt was very good with Israel. Yes, they are not, on the same page about every last political issue, but on big issues that relate to security, they have cooperated for a long time, to include, for example, cooperating even in ways that you wouldn't expect, like when there are bombings in the Sinai that were affiliated with ISIS or other groups, sometimes the Egyptians would put some of the wounded on planes and fly them into Israel for treatment, whether or not they were citizens of Israel or not. And so there's been a lot of cooperation. I fear that is going to be stressed to a degree that will diminish that relationship. And then I think, unfortunately, this is something that the officers at the War College didn't like to hear, but I think the U.S. role as a mediator in this conflict may be on the decline. Not because the president right now, President Biden, is not doing a good job, I think we can discuss that, but because U.S. mediation has for a very long time not gotten any further than it did for Oslo. And so, and I think also the attention of many people in the administrations, they have not wanted this to be the thing that they die in a ditch on. They don't want this to be their legacy very often, because most of the time it is not a great legacy. And then we can talk about Iran. I think Iran is still a big card that we don't know which direction it's going to go. Right now, the foreign minister is, I believe, in New York at the UN. I don't know if anybody heard the Iranian foreign minister speak, but he says the usual things. He's supporting Palestinians. He's admitting that that Iran has aided Hamas and aided other groups, but they're still explicitly denying that they have any kind of role in this last war that is now underway in Gaza. He also is very interesting because he himself is actually an Arab Middle East specialist, and it's the first time for many, many years that we've seen an Iranian foreign minister with that kind of credential, because usually they're very westernized, they are very competent, sometimes they have PhDs from MIT, and they're very good at speaking to the European community and negotiating. This one doesn't really even speak English very well, and his expertise is in Arabic. And my sense is that he was brought into, that he was put in his role when the last president was elected, President Raisi of Iran, because of the fact that the Abraham Accords was making Iran nervous, and so they found someone that could go and talk to the Arab world. So we'll see what this negotiator what this foreign minister can do. My guess is he's going around to Arab countries, and he's actually getting probably an earful from Arab leaders about the fact that this is about to get out of control in a way that no Arab country wants. And so it may, in some way, I hope, mitigate Iranian intentions. And then finally, and this is, a depressing note to end on, but I think it's very reasonable to assume that there is going to be a rise in global anti-Semitism, because the narrative frame for this conflict is changing. It is not the same kind of narrative that we have seen 20 or 30 years ago, where the Israelis seem to be prevailing in the moral sense and having the moral high ground. The narrative internationally has shifted, and this probably is going to create the unpleasant and ugly effect of a rise in anti-Semitism. What form it will take, I don't know, but I think, that cat is already out of the bag a bit. On that note, I would like to say thank you and hope that we can have nice conversation. Thank you very much.
Heidi, thank you so much for a thoughtful, a measured, and sadly a sobering talk, and most informative. So we thank you for your expertise and for your dedication to, I hope, a brighter future in the Middle East. I would like to tell you all that given the timing that we have planned, we're better off, I think, with going into our small groups now rather than have questions. If there are further questions, be sure to scout out Heidi privately, and happy to do that.